So I'd like to start tonight's conversation sort of focusing on language and writing, because it seems to be that language is at the center of not only the technology, since they are in fact large language, they're called large language models, and they're based on these humongous language data sets, but also because it's being touted as a tool to sort of relieve us of the tedium of writing. So in that sense, Ellen, in your book A Life in Code, in your chapter Programming the Post-Human, you do a wonderful job of sort of tracing how different words have become analogies to sort of represent human processes in a machine environment. So everything from intelligence to thinking to learning, all of these words have now suddenly acquired a different meaning. That chapter was written about 20 years ago, back in 2002, if I'm not mistaken. So in the last 20 years, how have you experienced this transformation of language, and what sort of ideology or worldview can we sort of discover hidden behind this sort of idea that we can use these words in such different contexts?
Well, before we go on, I'd like to say, to remind us all that the bot, and I will only call it that, and only knows what's on the internet. Right now, it's text. It's already working on images. It will no doubt go to movies, and whatever is on the internet, whatever is available. The technology will move on and on and on. So, but still, if it isn't on the internet, it can't be. So that's some consolation, because I think what I've written has been kind of raising alarms. And in the past 20 years, I have developed a more generational view. I see that how language changes, the use of language, the words change in response to whatever generation is living in whatever environment, including, especially here, we're talking about the technological environment. So, I'll give a small example. A friend's great-grandmother talked about how they hated electric light. It was harsh and terrible, and it blotted out the sky. And of course, a whole industry of lampshading came into being. If you think about that, how profound that is, to lose darkness, night, and I'll go very much quickly forward to our time, where there's barely a place on Earth where you can see the night sky. And astronomers are upset about these low-flying, these satellites now, are revolving around the Earth all the time. So, a short time, I lived in Ithaca many years ago, and I visited friends who we could say off the grid. And I walked out one night, and it was extremely clear, and it was a full moon. And I read all these books. I started as an English major. I am now in the process of reading the great masterpieces that every country thinks is their prime example. And, they talk about walking in the moonlight. And that's an experience very hard to have now. It's bright. It actually has a different kind of light. And also seeing the sky and the sense of great depth. And not just, you just look in and as far as your eye can see. And I think in some way we've lost a sense of our own insignificance. And our technology right now, but I think we're in a bit of a panic about the bot. I feel that things that have been written, it changes everything. It's as big as the internet, our sense of self. To some degree, that's right, but it's as if it's just panic. And in some ways, I'd like to talk against it. Maybe I don't think you think that was the kind of things I wanted to talk to. So every generation lives through its moments of panic and fear of how the environment is affecting them. Say the atom bomb, drought. I'm not trying to minimize what's happening to us, but I'm just trying to put it in the context. What we're fearing now in terms of technology, the onslaught of it, how it's changing us, changing society, as old as technology has. That is a kind of calming thought. You see, my 20 years have given me some distance, and I'm enjoying that. I feel there's anyway. What I am really concerned about with the coming of recent technology is the way technology has hijacked the sense of what's social and what chat means. And zoom back to what makes us human. Like other creatures, we're born like little pink things. We have no claws, we have no teeth. And so we had to develop, we had to join in groups. And joining in groups meant you had to know who's a friend, who's a foe. It means you had to identify people. Who you love, this one's great. I don't know about John. Stay away from Billy. And in that sense, we developed consciousness. I'm aware of who I am, and therefore Bill must know who he is. It's called theory of mind. And through that, we get a sense of consciousness. So interacting in language with other humans is essentially what made us what we are now. Creatures with awareness and self-awareness. So what we are going through now is that more and more of our time we're talking to artificial intelligence, or artificial, phone trees. And they got really good. They sound more natural. They learned how to stop saying dial one, instead press one. Now they have to move on to touch one. And one of the things about our interacting with humans is that we tendency to ascribe sentience to the creatures we see and the things we see in the world. Sherry Turkle talked about how children think their toys are alive. Their teddy bears are alive. Some go on to say not as alive as mommy and daddy, but alive. And look, I've been known to apologize to a favorite shoe that I mistreated. So, Larry Page believed that the internet would become intelligent. I have a little story about Gary Kasparov. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a grandmaster. 20 years ago, he played a tournament with Deep Blue, the IBM computer. And his reports were really interesting to me because he said, well, the first two games, they weren't easy. He was playing a worthy opponent, and he won, but he worked at it. The third game, he thought he saw some kind of intelligence, a sentience, a kind of being. And that totally threw him off his game. He lost the match. And so again, it's like ascribing sentience to artificial situations. And that's what we're doing now. That's what I'm afraid of, that using something like chat, GPT, kids will begin to see it as a smart being, not as a artificial tool created by human beings, but as another being, something alive. And that is, to me, the real danger of what's going on. I think, just briefly, we are going through a scary time. Each scary time comes and comes. But I think what, and you're dealing with education, but I think in technology, right now the people we need to talk to are, I call them kids, and going through the second huge bust of technology. I mean, it's going on like 100,000 tech people have just been wiped off cruelly. If you think how what happened with, and I think we have to talk to them about what how they think of technology now. And I think it'd be very different from the people I knew who were great believers in a city on a hill, the internet, so on, singularities. I think there'll be a sobering here and a more introspective look at technology. And so I suppose that's what I have to say. I know I didn't completely address your question, but again, I've kind of moved off to, I stand by all the alarms I've set, and I'll be happy to put up a whole lot more, but the, to me, the big concern is the projecting of sentience onto AI, which is more and more lifelike. And it challenges our idea of what it means to be alive. I think, okay, that's a good alarm, right?
Right. And in that sense, do you think is this process of sort of projecting sentience on these artificial tools, is that do you think an innate characteristic of humans, or is it part of the environment in which it's happening in, or is it a little bit of both?
I think what you said, I mean, as I said, it's not innate. We're innately able to understand language. That Noam Chomsky, if you read him, that what he talks about. But this idea of sentience developed in the course of our experiences living as human beings. So it was developed in us. And I do think it's completely normal, because we had to ascribe sentience to the people who were with us, that it's entirely normal that we would keep doing that when we encounter something. Seems a lot.
Right. And it's certainly something that I've in my conversations with teachers, I've noticed that even because you mentioned your concern for young children to be to grow up seeing these tools as living beings, and it's also pretty impressive that it's had the same sort of effect on adults and on teachers themselves, and how they sort of communicate, or they express their experiences with these tools in terms almost as if though you were talking about another person, and I guess that's sort of where I'm sort of concerned about how we're changing words to mean entirely different things, or at least using them in contexts that are completely different from what they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. In particular, these words that have to do with the human cognitive process of thinking, remembering, etc. Lance, I wonder if maybe you could give us your viewpoint on this, on how language has been changing these, and by language I mean these words in particular, words that have to do with the human thought process, and how they're now being used in machine contexts, and I'm curious to know what your perspective on this might be.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm pretty much in agreement with Ellen on everything she said, and it's an interesting point about theory of mind. I wrote a little bit about that in my last book concerning communication, but particularly in relation to autism, which is where that idea comes up originally, because in one sense, when you said innate, I just thinking that there's nothing that's purely innate and there's nothing that's purely environmental. It's always in the interaction between the two. But the idea of theory of mind was based on evolutionary psychology. But individuals with autism are, and one of their deficits is a lack of theory of mind, which is not something that's a deficit in individuals with other cognitive issues. So I do think that we do have a tendency to project consciousness onto all kinds of things, and that in fact you can see the evolutionary advantage of that, because long before we develop scientific explanations, if I just imagine that there's some angry supernatural being up in the clouds hurling thunderbolts down at me, it's as good a way as any to get to the practical point of seeking shelter during a thunderstorm. Right. So, I mean, it's a very efficient way of thinking about things. So, in the same way, when we talk about mind as a black box, I was just noticed something, but I was reading something by Gregory Bateson where he pointed out that metaphor of the black box is a technological metaphor, which was the idea that certain machines were booby-trapped to blow up so you didn't touch them, and that's where they got the idea of, and sort of like an impenetrable technology. So what you're bringing up is we never ever really came to any sense of what intelligence means. It's a word, it's a high-level abstraction that we talk about as if it were a thing, something that really exists, and we just use it to describe various kinds of behaviors. But long ago, people decided that it can be measured. Stephen Jay Gould did a whole book on this called The Mismeasure of Man, where he went through from the 19th century, where they took skulls and measured the volume of the skull by filling it with buckshot or birdseed to show that white people were more intelligent, had bigger brains than black people, and that men had bigger brains than women, and therefore were more intelligent, through to the IQ tests, which we, of course, know very well are culturally biased. And of course, we later get to the point of the idea of Howard Gardner's idea of multiple intelligences as a different way, that there's a difference. There's not one thing intelligence. There's many things, such as you might say that mathematical intelligence is not the same thing as literary intelligence, and that there's emotional and social intelligence, and so on. By the way, that also originates to some extent with the people looking at autism, because where you have the savant phenomenon of the isolated islands of intelligence, so you could have someone who's a savant in math and in all other aspects are far below the norm. So we never really know what we're talking about, and ultimately we reach out for metaphors. So the blank slate was a metaphor. So was the garden, which is, we don't think of we think of gardens as natural, but they're technologies too. They're human artificial creations to bring a little bit of something that we call nature, but that we've actually created into our lives. And later on, in more recent times, we've come to the kind of electronic and information metaphors for intelligence. So the mind is like an information processor, memory is like information storage. But it really comes down to, we're never really quite clear on what we're talking about. In the same way we come up with mathematical or quantitative metaphors. So, so okay, Camilla, your intelligence is 93. That's what it is. And forgetting that it's just a device that we've created, and whatever this test is that we give you, that we come up with a numerical score, we say that's your intelligence. So we're never going to really be sure of what's going on. we might ascribe intelligence or consciousness to a computer program, but by the same token, right now I'm looking at a computer screen, at two faces on a computer screen, and I don't know who the hell you people are, or if you're real people, or some kind of AI constructs. How can I tell? So ultimately, we're always going to be in this kind of position of mystery, and we're really reliant to some extent on faith to make our way through things. And the pragmatic test, does it work? Will it work for me if I assume that you're conscious and intelligent, and that helps me in my interaction with you? Then maybe that's all that matters.
Interesting. And I guess that sort of way of seeing things is definitely probably where the engineers and the folks at Silicon Valley are coming from. And in fact, they state as much often when you read or when you hear them speak. They'll say that in fact there's no reason to think that intelligence is something that's limited to biological organisms, and if we were really honest with ourselves, we'd allow for different kinds of intelligences in different kinds of entities, biological or non-biological.
Well, sure, but they're working from the opposite end, where they're saying that, or they're assuming that they can identify what intelligence is,
Right?
And it's whatever is, and they're using the metaphor of information processing, right. And that if you've got enough processing power, then you wind up with an intelligent being, right. In silicon form, where I'm kind of coming at it at the opposite point of view, that we never know, where's human intelligence? We can't really tell, except based on behavior and again, on a kind of, faith basis. But it's more like, is anything really intelligent, or do we really even know what we're talking about? One of the things I remember from it was like in the early 90s, when there was a lot of talk about, the time that the internet was starting to become a popular phenomenon, and some folks were writing, and it was going back to T.S. Eliot, in Courses from the Rock. He writes, that where is the knowledge that is lost in information, and where is the wisdom that's lost in knowledge? And they were writing, the tech people were writing, with enough information you get knowledge, and with enough knowledge you get wisdom. And to me, that is this quantitative mentality that is completely off base, because there are totally different kinds of qualitative phenomenon. Personally, coming from a media ecology approach, I would put it this way, that electronics is what really makes us think about information, and signal transmission is at the heart of it, whereas books are where knowledge reside. And before books, there's no idea of knowledge. There's knowing, things, but the idea that knowledge exists as something separate from a human being really comes up with the idea of a book, and this false sense that knowledge resides in the book rather than in the writer and in the reader. And so wisdom is in the people, in the person. And again, I would connect to what Ellen is saying, in the social interaction. Wisdom is something that's in each of us to some extent, and in our experience and in our collective interaction, our community. We can talk about the wisdom of a collective and of a community, rather than the knowledge held by an individual.
I'd like to add to that, or kind of put, a little bit on the other side. The problem is that many of these believers in non-human intelligence think that, in other words, that our experiences or the act of living or of knowing can be disembodied. That biology is not really a factor in intelligence, but of course that's ridiculous. Kurzweil is my favorite straw man. His belief somehow that he could, download his brain into a computer and people would have it for the next generation. Well, that hasn't happened. Cutting off your head and freezing it, freezing your brain. So, well, you can do that, but essentially you'll be dead. These are, and again, Larry Page thinking with it. It's an emergent theory. With enough participants in a system, intelligence will emerge. And some people believe that that's the same with us. We have all these synapses, and with enough connections, we are intelligent. However, it's completely different because we don't have that many synapses, and our DNA hasn't proven that we are supreme beings. What a disappointment when they finally, decoded the whole DNA to find out, well, we were biologically speaking or DNA speaking no more than roundworms. So, it must be something else that it isn't chunk, a protein creates, the gene creates a protein, creates a body, and so on. Now it had to be, anyway, I can go on. These questions bring up so many side effects in this. It's like spikes, and there's so many trails one could go down, and it's hard to limit the discussion. I yield that.
No, thank you for that. And I was thinking that perhaps also the other issue behind the questioning of what intelligence is and the misunderstanding or the inability to actually explain or to have a consensual idea of what intelligence is also has a huge repercussion on our education systems. And our education systems, whether in the U.S. or here in Spain where I am now, or in Mexico where I'm from, or in China or any part of the world, education systems usually have their many detractors and people that are very capable in pointing out lots of things that are wrong or that they feel they could be improved with or they feel that they need to be improved. When we start to throw into that complex system of education systems, when we throw into that these new technologies that are sort of claiming to be able to help us by doing things that we don't do as well as they can. And in particular with ChatGPT, the claim is that it can write like a human can. So why would a human being want to write if it can just type in a little prompt and have this machine write for it? Lance, I'm wondering if you could give us your perspective on what you think that might have as a consequence on these education systems that were already perhaps deficient to begin with, and now have this additional complexity thrown at them, which are these generative tools.
Well, I mean, first of all, education is always a loser's game in the sense that we fail constantly. Our students never live up to what we would like them to be, and we're always looking for new ways, new techniques, new methods, and to solve that problem, to get through to them, and nothing ever works. I don't mean to be completely pessimistic here, but it's just that it's extremely difficult, and especially you're connecting it to writing, and correctly so, because if we change the subject or change the emphasis from education, and especially from learning, which happens naturally, and education, which every culture engages in, to schooling specifically, there are no schools before writing is invented. And right after writing is invented, then you have schools, because it's completely unnatural. It completely goes against the grain of human existence. That's why the first thing in school is just to learn to sit still. That's, whether it's preschool or in my day, it was just kindergarten. But before you can learn how to write, you have to learn how to sit still. And what can be more unnatural than asking a very young child to just sit down and not move? And it goes completely against who we are. So it is entirely artificial. And this is something that's been pointed out by a number of scholars in this area, Eric Havelock, back in the day. And my old professor and mentor, Christine Nystrom, wrote a lovely essay called Literacy as Deviance. It was published in the General Semantics Journal, etc., and it's part of a collection that was put out posthumously called Genes of Culture. And she points, literally that it is a deviant behavior because it's just not normal for humans to be literate. It's difficult, it's hard. So we're always going to face that challenge, and then you're going to say, okay, you don't have to write. I forgot who it was, the fellow who said that only a fool writes for free. It's just, and as academics are such big fools after all, because we do that all the time. And it's true, writing is hard. It's difficult. So you're going to now give me a technology that's going to write for me. And, for most of us, it's going to be whoopee. That frees me up from the burden of having to do that. And there is reason for that. There are kind of analogous developments where it used to be that you have to memorize everything, and then books become readily available, and now you don't have to memorize everything. You have to look them up, and we see that as a boon. Okay, and this is why back in antiquity, Plato's Phaedrus, one of the criticisms of writing is that it will destroy memory. You won't need to use your memory. It's use it or lose it. And you'll have the appearance of knowing things without actually knowing them. We don't see that as necessarily a negative, but, certainly in this case, I think where we're headed, which is ultimately the point, is to go back to a point where there's very little literacy. And much of what we're doing, it's the case of the audiobook, and voice synthesis, it's Siri and her relatives and all of that, where a lot of what was accomplished through reading and writing will be turned back into speaking, into the spoken word. I do think that's a real loss. I think that is probably, historically, literates represented a minority. It's only in the last couple of centuries that we've had the idea of social literacy and almost the goal of universal literacy. Most of history, it's been a class distinction. So the people who could read and write were either of a ruling class or a priesthood, or whatever position in society, they were of a superior position than those who were unable to read and write. And I think we're going back to that kind of situation ultimately. And this is a step along that way.
Right. So in that sense, perhaps schools, as they incorporate these tools more and more, are ultimately, in a very impactful way, risking contributing to that very real possibility of becoming a sort of illiterate society once again, or at least in certain ways.
Or of really contributing to their own demise.
Right, exactly.
Which is nothing new for educators. And the fact, and especially folks in your position, but also in here in higher ed too, that latching on to the latest technology, and especially with computing and digital technologies, are ways for eliminating more and more teachers. We don't have to pay you a salary when we can just record your lectures and have the students listen to them. We put ourselves out of business by embracing all of that instead of simply going back to the idea that education is about reading and discussing what we've read. That's the original meaning, with teacher, rabbi, guru. It's the person who interpreted the text for you, because in many instances, the author of the text is not present and may be long gone. So the person becomes the mediator between the student and the text. But that's really what education has been about, but we keep trying to move away from that. And frankly, at least here in American society, there's been a long-standing distrust of teachers, which is why, it goes back to textbooks. Textbooks are a way to make classrooms teacher-proof. You can't trust what the teacher's going to teach, so put it in the textbook. That way we know that they'll get it, and the teacher has to teach to the textbook. But, it's also about establishing what the curriculum could be or should be, and not giving teachers leeway to do what they want, because you can't trust teachers. They're no good. They have minds of their own.
Right.
May I say that I think there are wonderful uses for chat. And one of the great things that I've looked for these examples where you learn by using it. Okay? It isn't just that it writes for you. If students have a question, a financial analyst who very knowledgeable in that field asked GPT to write a financial guide for someone who's investing, and it came up with a perfectly normal, balanced portfolio, stocks, bonds, cash, and then the analyst began asking more questions that went deeper and deeper and deeper into more specific, more technical terms. And the bot, I will always call it, the answers became more vague and general, kind of floated off. And then an amazing thing happened. As he went on, and it suddenly came up and said, "I don't know." And how hard is it to get a human to say, "I don't know"? And eventually he went to the bottom. I think students can play with it. In other words, keep asking. Keep, asking more, take a topic, something they know or might know, and just keep asking questions to go down more deeply. I think perhaps having a whole class start with the same question, and each one then goes on to do it, how they ask further questions, and to see what happens, to see the varieties, and understand how this is a human tool and it's affected by the way humans use it. I remember one teacher I had in high school, he assigned us all to read different newspapers, and we were supposed to report back on a particular event. And we learned how the different built-in, one was more right-wing, one was middle, or left-wing, just to understand that there were viewpoints underneath this. And I think there's ways to have fun with it. Write a play, have them write a play, act it out. Kids love to act out. Act plays, and recite, memorization. That's really, really got a bad name. But memorizing poems, I think to bring back the fun and the enjoyment of literature is a problem. And memorizing a poem, really can change your life. Years and years later, I think about how it turns over. Something in my Puritan heritage makes me love that spate of ice, that kind of understanding of a different mind altogether. And I stupidly decided to memorize Jabberwocky. But again, memorization is not a bad thing. I mean, of good literature. Another thing is for writing, this is sometimes an exercise I do as a writer, trying to be a better writer. Take a passage I like from a book or anything I've read, and then write it out verbatim and see how it was done in a way. You can intuit it. You're riding along with the mind of the author. I just want to interject one thing about education creating its demise here. I think in many ways, what really killed the teaching of literature at the higher level was structuralism. Suddenly, work wasn't seen as an integrated thing, authored, but as a bunch of pointers, influence that's everywhere else. This was just sort of some mishmash of everything else around, which of course it is. But somehow that was not respected. And it kind of took away when you read a good book, the awe of it. It's not a connection with a human being. It's somehow pointers to pointers to pointers. I mean, it's a computing approach to reading and understanding literature. So, I mean, in the higher level, I mean, this goes back a way, and people began to drop out literature classes. People I knew who were getting PhDs just said to hell with these classes, and finally to hell with getting a higher degree in literature, even history or essay. And so there are many ways that we can undo it, and that's one of them, I think.
In that regard,
could I just say to that though?
Yes, yes.
That as far as memorization, the problem initially was that when all there was memorization, you didn't have the sort of distancing of being able to look at things critically, and you have to just try to keep it going, keep it in mind. But and we really do reach the other extreme, because I totally agree that memorizing poetry was something that was taught for a long time, and then it's decided that you don't have to do that at all, and it gets to the point where you don't even have to know about a book. You can just do a Google search to find things. So we lose memory more and more along the way with each technological iteration. It's the same thing copying by hand. There was never any concern with plagiarism when I was a kid. We copied out of the encyclopedia and handed that in. And I think, it goes back to scribal culture, where if you're writing it out by hand, it's going through your head. But when you get to copy and paste on a computer, you don't even have to have any idea of what you're copying and pasting. It becomes so distant from our own minds that there's no longer any value to that. But I think, sure, that we can have fun with these things, and I'm not, so much of the agita about ChatGPT that I saw was about students, and they'll use that to write their papers, and how will we be able to tell? And and for me, it's like, students have been cheating all along.
Sure.
When I was,
I mean, to get breakthrough nostalgia here about our past, footnotes.
yeah.
So, you had a book to read. Well, no, I'm going to use footnotes.
Yeah. When I was an undergrad, and I was in a fraternity, and they had a filing cabinet full of papers that you could copy. But so what worries me is not the students; it's the teachers. What worries me is that using that AI and saying we don't need a human being to teach this. We can just turn it over to the AIs, and they're already using this sort of thing for grading. I think maybe they were using it for the SATs for grading essays, or someone was, but that is going to be where the bigger kind of concern, that I see is when it comes down to teaching, that the replace, because again, it goes back to they don't trust teachers. Nobody likes teachers. Nobody trusts teachers. So get rid of them, and then you can completely program what they're going to teach, and so you don't have to. You can eliminate all that woke stuff that these teachers are doing, and or if you want, you can eliminate them from mentioning any kind of religious belief. When they're talking to students, whatever it is that you don't want, you can achieve this sort of perfection in the programming, and by eliminating the human beings, in the same playfulness, Ellen. I remember having bad teachers, and I came through New York City public schools, and there were some teachers that, we laughed about and made fun of. But I think that's part of the point too, is to realize that they're human beings, and some of them were actually stupid, or, but that's part of the process too. It's relating. It's human beings relating to one another.
Absolutely, and to get back to that point of the mistrust that there is between teachers to students, plagiarizing, or government and society with teachers. One of the interesting things that I saw, because of that concern that you point out, Lance, is also one of the ones that I started to sort of feel as well, in that I started to see a lot of teachers wanting to use these tools to generate their lesson plans. So sort of how, like what you mentioned about the textbook, sort of being just as a simple go-to script for a person who might have zero preparation or knowledge or even interest. Here's the textbook, open it to page 5, follow the instructions, you can't get lost. In the same sort of sense, a lot of teachers are seeing these tools as a way of getting out of the tedium of writing their own lesson plans. Like they see preparing their lessons as an unfortunate thing that they have to do as part of the job. And there's this interesting sort of phenomenon with the word personalization in education, where you would think that personalization has to do with sort of what you guys have been describing, the sort of interaction between persons. But in the education technology world, what that's becoming more and more is an artificial intelligence being used to generate content for the student. The student then responds to the content, and then this artificial intelligence responds and gives feedback to that input from the student. And if you add in the element of the student perhaps using an AI to generate his or her response, then through personalization in that whole loop, you've extracted the person entirely. You have an AI generating the lesson. You have a student using AI to generate the response. And then you have AI giving the feedback. And the sort of terrifying thing to me as a teacher is that I see everyone sort of on board with this. I see teachers that seem to be okay with this. I see school administrators that seem to be okay with this. And of course, the education technology industry is more than happy to make sure that this gets done. Sort of within that sort of nightmarish dystopian scenario in schools, Ellen, what would be your approach to teaching writing and sort of inspiring young children to feel that sort of sense of awe when they're reading, and to sort of feel excited about the possibility of being able to write when, like Lance mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, it definitely goes against human nature to sit down and sit still and read something and think about something and then sit down and write and correct, and that is sort of against our nature. But in the end, many of us do discover that that awe factor. We do enjoy writing.
Well, enjoy writing. Well, all right, I'm going to talk to you more about that. People say, "Oh, you're just writing. Oh, you must be so happy."
Right, right.
But, that's,
Not okay. It's exactly. It's not exactly. It's not exactly joy.
but you're definitely dedicated or somehow misguided into spending a life writing. It's not for the faint, heart. So I think this is going. I am not an educator. I mean, I've gone through schools, obviously the New York school system, and I got great education actually in high school. A couple of incredible teachers who, we wrote plays. We wrote puppet shows, and we acted them out. And the kids wrote that. It what they wrote turned into things that people were acting out, and they were acting out. It was wonderful. And some people made the puppets, some people wrote the plays, and I think for young kids especially, much fun now. I think also it's okay to tell kids this is not easy. This will require of you something that may not come naturally to you, or may, that it's okay to have it be a mess. Don't make it neat. The worst thing that ever happened to writers is like spell check. It looks like it's all neat and it's done when actually it's all very raw. I advise writers to do a spell check, polish this a little bit, and then start a new file where it's going to look like the mess it is in your mind when you start. And just to tell kids that you'll get better if you want. Practice, you will get better. And it will be fun only if you let yourself be silly or not what you're exactly supposed to do. I think that's the only way to let the kids, especially younger ones, third and fourth grade. I remember it is to just let them know you don't have to write something perfect. You don't need to get an A. We're not giving grades on. This is your experience, and you'll find out what it is to write or what you never want to do. There's expository writing and there's expressive writing. And I think the expressive writing is where both the difficulty and the awe and the satisfaction, but it's harder. One of the things people are talking about using GPT is to write technical writing. This goes back to the tech industry. Tech, it's really boring, right? When in this file, open that file, see this, do this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and if that doesn't work, see page 90. But one of the things I want to say about this, it seems really boring, but it's a very human occupation, because anyone who has worked in a large system knows that trying to find out what actually is true and right and correct involves dealing with programmers who are very bad at giving information that's coherent, finding the relationship between one module and another. One side tells you one thing, one side tells you the other. There's a lot of, you have to work things out between people. So even something as seeming as, ripe for a computer to do, actually involves so much human interaction and understanding. So I've gone far of your original question, but I don't see. I'm really surprised when you open this up. I was really surprised to hear that teachers love it. My impression was that they hated it and felt used and abandoned. That there was a kind of fear and anger, almost a panic about this. So I'm really surprised to hear what you said. is there more a mix among teachers? Are there some who are cautious, you know, raising the alarms?
Interestingly, I was surprised as well. I was genuinely surprised as well. And my first reaction to it was to think that maybe the people in my Twitter feed were of a particular sort, like very tech friendly, tech savvy sort of educators. And so I sort of organized a quick online survey for teachers in lots of different schools, and realized with the results of that survey that most teachers are I think most teachers are probably sort of indifferent to the whole situation. They couldn't care less one way or another. But then you have another large group of teachers that are actually enthusiastic, and then you have that minority of super pushy tech people that are, well, their jobs are literally to get people excited about using technology in the classroom, and they're obviously, just over the top enthusiastic. But personally, my concern, my original concern was precisely how concerned most teachers seem to be, except for that point that Lance mentioned, the whole plagiarism idea, which seems to always, give teachers nightmares, even though it's always happened and it'll always happen, and it's just a natural sort of part of going to school and being a teacher.
One thing I'd like, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting, go ahead.
But yeah, but other than that, that was basically it. Which seems very strange
One
to
thing
me.
I'd say to teachers is trying to find out if this was original writing or something written by GPT is a complete waste of time. It'll just drive you crazy because it's an arms race. I mean, it will always get better. The idea of putting some kind of mark on it or something to indicate it was written by a computer, it's not going to happen. Whatever attempts to make it seem clear that it came from a bot, it's just going to be overwritten. So there's just no point in worrying about it. Complete waste of time.
Right. I think I agree, and it is an arms race, and there's already lots of companies that are promoting their tools to detect GPT written text, and it's just this ongoing thing. Lance, I wonder if we could maybe look back on Neil Postman and some of the insights that he shared in some of his writings. In Amazing Ourselves to Death, you obviously go over his career and his work, and you go over his main ideas. I couldn't help but wonder, though, what a conversation between you and him would be like now. If you were to, just if his spirit were to be conjured in front of you, and you could tell him what has happened since, in the last 20 years or so since he passed away. If you were to explain to him how things have changed and in the direction in which they've gone, what would you tell him, and what would you imagine his response to be?
Well, I could say his response would be, "See, I told you." But and he would also scold me because I do violate one of his rules, which is to never use visual aids. And I will play YouTube videos and the like in classrooms. So I would, obviously, I mean, I think it's pretty clear to summarize. I need didn't really see social media, and so tell them about that, about the mobile devices, and now as we're with this new phenomenon of Chat GPT, which he would remind me that he had assigned computer power and human reason by Joseph Weizenbaum. And
which by the way, sorry for interrupting, Weizenbaum makes that really great point of how we project consciousness and sentience
Yeah.
on these little bots. Right.
Which,
Fascinating.
yeah, it goes back to Eliza and, and the fact that his secretary said, get out of the room. I want to talk to Eliza. And that after coming up with it, which he thought was, just kind of an experiment based on Rogerian psychotherapy, that I think it was Psychology Today, treated that seriously and said that they could imagine a future where there'll be kiosks that you can go to and get therapy from an AI. Which I did see something about along the same lines in reference to ChatGPT. And actually having done some of that as an undergraduate, having trained in some of that sort of crisis counseling on the telephone, it's highly technical. There are like these set of techniques that you use that you take yourself out of as a person and just reflect back what someone's saying. So it's actually quite easy to program that in, and I think that's part of where it goes to. I think he would acknowledge this as well, that there's nothing new about us becoming machine-like. And I think he would remind us about Lewis Mumford, who wrote that the first machine was organized human labor in antiquity to build the pyramids and irrigation ditches and the first armies and so forth. And it was only later that the fallible human parts of this machine, this organization, were replaced by more reliable inhuman parts, into what we typically think of as a machine. So there's nothing new. I mean, this has been going on all along. And I think, you point that out, and it comes back again to the point of what really counts are people's relationships, and particularly face to face. So I think, part of the question would be, would I be telling him this? Would I be having a seance via Zoom and, talking to this disembodied face and voice? I think he would have a problem with that. But, if we were sitting together in the same room, I think that's the response, along with, come on, let's go out for a drink. And by the way, how are the Mets doing?
In some of his writings, he was obviously very, very critical of television and the effects that it had on society. And now, of course, in this new sort of, we went from the television era, we went into the internet era, social media, etc. Where are we sort of? Where do you see we're going to in this next big epoch, this moment in media history? What are we stepping into?
What are we stepping into is probably an apt way to put it. But I think it goes back to, we have been here before. And I think, when you mention the AI images, I mean, think about photography and how people had spent all this time, over centuries developing the ability to produce images in perspective, and is actually a highly technical skill in a lot of ways. But photography comes along and does it better ultimately than any human being can. And in a sense, provides a kind of authenticity. I mean, Susan Sontag makes this point that we would see a kind of fuzzy, out of focus photograph of Shakespeare as being better, more authentic than a highly detailed portrait painted by the greatest artist of that time. So that happens, but it frees up, on the other hand, people have to look for other avenues. I mean, and this is where McLuhan pointed to the artist as the person who is going to explore the boundaries of what there is and find new ways of perceiving the world and thinking about the world. So I don't think we're, as Ellen made this point earlier, I don't think we're in that unique a moment of time as people think we are. But it does come down to a few things. For Postman, he liked to ask the question: to what problem is this a solution? And it's a really great question because, if the problem is, well, I don't like to write, it's hard, then, okay, well, there's your solution. But then what do you lose when by gaining this new way of doing things? And that's a bigger, more important kind of question because, he would also say, tech people love to say what a new technology will do for you, and what they never talk about is what it will undo. And that is similar to, we mentioned Weizenbaum said, just because we can do something doesn't mean we ought to do it. And that goes back to human agency, which is what we're always giving up. And I also think, the other person I would invoke is Jacques Ellul, who's always trying to bring things back to, what happens to the human quality. But he wasn't a pessimist in the sense that, he's writing about how technology is out of control, but with the hope that we can regain control. But until we make that conscious decision to regain control, it's not going to happen. So I think, those would be the kinds of concerns where we have to ask, what is it that we want and what is it that's proper for us to do? And a big one is responsibility. That you can program the AI to do all kinds of things, including decide who should live and who should die, where should medical resources go. When they talk about the government, the conservatives talk about the government and whatever, death panels or whatever. But that kind of thinking, what's the acceptable number of casualties in a nuclear exchange? I mean, this was stuff, these sort of calculations. How many insect parts are okay to have in your yogurt? That's a calculation that people make, right? At what point are heroic efforts to keep someone alive worth it? And at what point, how much money should someone pay for a wrongful death? I mean, these are horrible calculations, but these are technical questions that need to be answered. So, okay, you want to employ some technology to do these instead of having people do them. It's not that different from having people do the math with paper and pencil and doing it with a calculator or a computer program. The ultimate question, though, is who has responsibility? And that's where, if we give up the responsibility, that is the concern. That's where we've lost it. So that's what we have to keep in mind, is that we have to be responsible. And Martin Buber said, responsibility, the word in there is response. A human response is what's required for responsibility. And that's what, the AI can give you an inhuman response and tell you how, what the criteria were for the calculation, but they can't give you a human response. And that's what we need. That's where the danger lies, is when we give that over, we're done.
And in that sense, Ellen, would you say, am I just being paranoid in thinking that, or overly pessimistic in thinking that a lot of folks in Silicon Valley just don't have much regard for human beings, and they're actively antagonistic, and therefore don't really have a very high regard for that human response that Lance just mentioned. In fact, I think they're trying to program that out of society. Am I just totally paranoid?
Well, there is a large contingent that does that. I have just, when you said anti-human, I I have a strong reaction against that because there are so many people involved in technology who actually have a joy in seeing how they can build something. And we are, Homo sapien. We are also Homo faber. We are the tool maker, and all through the time. And part of our intelligence is previsioning. What do I need? How do I make that? And engineering in some way is also very visual. Most of the systems start with diagrams and pictures and how to organize your thoughts, which is extremely hard. And I have to say, I find a joy in engineering. NASA, Ingenuity rover on Mars. I watched that unfold. It's extremely difficult. What they planned was so complicated. I could not imagine how it could work. And as it was live, they put up, module 1, interface to module 2, interface. And every time it went to interface, I was in terror because nothing creates bugs and misunderstandings except in those interfaces between what groups of people have fun and the communication problem. So a lot of people in it really take pleasure. I mean, there is a sense where you want to do something and you sit back and you go, it works. I mean, at least until, version 3 or 4, when you learn out it doesn't work. But yes, there are also very many there is a level of autism involved, especially on the male side of the people I've met. And there is difficulty relating to humans in a social sense, one-to-one. And therefore, the interaction with the machine is more comfortable for them. And Lance, would you go along with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a daughter with autism. She's an adult now, but when she was diagnosed, one of the things, and they weren't sure, trying to be positive about it, and they said, "Oh, one of the kind of professionals said, well, she'll probably be a computer programmer." So, and when you read, I mean, I think you were, Sherry Turkle writing about, those folks, particularly in the early days in the, I guess the Harvard lab and all of that, and it sounds very much like individuals with Asperger's, the way they're described. So certainly, yeah.
Well, I've known some who were actually quite brilliant in the computer field. I had someone in my family who was a revered software engineer, and he actually cannot talk to people. His brother says sometimes, he just can't be a human being. He believed completely in IQ as a predictor of success, and he met his wife through a computer dating service. So it's from one strong to just a general discomfort with interaction. That said, there are extremely smart and fun and communicative people. There are many who are left academia, so you have, all but dissertation geologists or history or Greek literature, and so there is a mix in there of people who, especially people who do testing, who have to deal with programmers who being angry at them. It's a mix of people. I know what you're saying, Camilo, about this is a world made by people who are anti-human. I don't think it's that simple. I just don't think it's that simple. We are tool makers. If we did not make tools, we'd be, dead. Live in houses.
Sure.
So you can keep going all the way. And is Tesla anti-human? Is that car anti-human? Or is it letting humans get away from the tedium of driving on the freeway? Of course, they crash and they have bugs. I would never drive a driverless car. I mean, it's called self-driving car, but actually, if you think that what it is driverless, again, you've taken away the human. You've taken away what humans can do naturally. If you're even halfway aware, when a car is coming very quickly behind you, you know it. When someone goes past you very fast, leave them alone. Four-way stop. You can read a four-way stop by what kind of car it is, whether they lightly touch their brakes, but mostly people have, four-way stop, people have to look at each other. And one of the early attempts at driverless cars, one of the first crashes was at a four-way stop, because there are rules in a four-way stop. Oh, the car that got there first, if there's a tie, it's the car on the right. And well, they follow those rules, and people don't follow those rules.
But
they don't know them. They look at each other. So, what do you take?
Jump in on that example, though, because, I mean, it's just such a perfect example of the problem of responsibility. Because if I'm driving a car and I cause an accident, I hit somebody, then the responsibility is clearly with me. Now you have the self-driving car, and it hits somebody, and I'm at the wheel, but I mean it's the car itself. I'm not in control of the car. Who's responsible? Is it me because I didn't take control of the car? Is it the programming? Is it the car manufacturer? We no longer are able to assign responsibility because we've taken away, we've replaced human agency with this complexity. And so much of the world today is like that, where you can't, this banking meltdown, who's responsible for it? Is it the government? Is it the economy? Is it COVID? Is it the rising interest rates? Nobody, is it the banking officials? Is it the stock market? It becomes out of control because nobody can take responsibility and nobody can take blame for what's happening. And that's the big problem, beyond just, the real questions of should we have self-driving cars or not. So I'm sorry to interrupt. I just, it just seemed like that's such an excellent example of that.
One of the, funniest or oddest things, one of the self-driving cars actually was responsible for hitting another car. And so usually you call the police and they come and they make a police report and so on. Well, the police showed up and had no idea what to do. I mean, who do you give the ticket to? I mean, how is this integrated into our system of responsibility? As you said, I wrote that word down 3 times and underlined it. Thank you for pointing that out. That is so crucial.
And I guess that's sort of the underlying issue behind all of these topics and all of these issues, which is that ultimately, when you throw a technology like this out into the world, without any prior consulting, without any conversation, without any sort of critical criteria, weighing of pros and cons, you just throw it out there and let people sort of figure it out. Seems like a highly risky. It seems like a very risky thing to do, and I guess we're out of time pretty much. So so we're sort of coming full circle and sort of starting at the ending at the beginning. But in the end, it is sort of what worries me as an educator, going back to specifically the world of teaching and learning, is that they've unleashed these tools which weren't designed to be, which weren't designed with pedagogy in mind. They weren't, designed with teacher input or student input. and then suddenly they're in schools, and we all have to just sort of learn how to deal with them and adapt to them. And it seems like as a society we're constantly doing this. Like technology companies unleash these tools, and then sort of leave the world, sort of scratching its head, and sort of it's our problem to figure out what it is that we're going to do with them, whether we asked for them or not, whether we participated in their development or not. But I guess that'll have to be another conversation because our time is up. But Lance and Ellen, thank you so very much for your time. I really appreciate your
Camille.
generosity and your insight and all of your experience and your points of view. They're truly very, very, very valuable. And thank you so much.
Thank
It's
you.
been a pleasure. Thank you.
Good time. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.